She wasn't wearing a badge. She didn't belong in the cockpit. She was just there to wipe down coffee stains. Until the co-pilot stood up, pale and trembling, and pointed at her. "You landed!" Welcome to Velvo Stories, where some uniforms hide more than a rank, and sometimes the one cleaning the plane is the only one who can save it. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from right now? No one noticed her when she boarded. She wore a plain maintenance jumpsuit, carried a cleaning tote in one hand and a checklist folded in the other. She didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't make eye contact, didn't wear a name tag. To most, she was invisible, just another airport worker doing a final sweep before takeoff. Gate 27B was running behind schedule. Flight 714 to Vancouver was already boarded, passengers still shifting in their seats, overhead bins slamming shut as last-minute bags were crammed inside. The cleaning crew had been rushed in post-boarding to fix a spill in row 11 and sanitize the front galley. Quick in, quick out. That was the deal. She moved with practiced efficiency, aisle to galley, cockpit to lavatory. Wiped, scrubbed, adjusted. Never intrusive, never slow. Her presence barely registered with the flight attendants, who were more focused on juggling late passenger manifests and gate change confusion. The pilot and co-pilot, both already seated up front, barely glanced over as she stepped into the flight deck to clean the jump seat area. But in that moment, just a brief second, her eyes scanned the control panel with a stillness that didn't match her uniform, and something flickered across her face. A memory, a calculation, a map she hadn't seen in years, but still knew by heart. 30 minutes later, the doors were closed. The plane pushed back. Most of the cleaning crew had exited during final call, except her. She wasn't supposed to still be aboard, but a paperwork mix-up, or maybe something else, had kept her on the manifest as temporary support personnel. The lead flight attendant shrugged and told her to buckle in the rear crew jump seat. "You'll disembark in Vancouver, no big deal, happens." She nodded, didn't argue, didn't explain that she'd seen the captain's name on the placard and recognized it, or that the co-pilot's face had triggered something sharp in her memory, or that the layout of this aircraft wasn't just familiar, it was intimate, because this wasn't just any flight. This was the Airbus A750 prototype, and she had flown it before the name on her license had been erased. At 22,000 feet, turbulence struck. Normal at first, then sharper. Passengers stirred. Seatbelt signs chimed on. At 27,000, the flight attendant tried to get a response from the cockpit and got silence. At 29,000, the door opened, and the co-pilot stumbled out, sweat pouring down his temples, eyes wild. "He has a problem," he whispered. Then he saw her, still strapped in, expression calm, and he said something no one could have expected. "You landed." For a second, no one moved. The flight attendant closest to the cockpit froze mid-step, coffee pot in hand. A passenger in 3C peered curiously toward the open cockpit door. Even the hum of the engine seemed to hesitate, as if the entire aircraft had paused to comprehend the gravity of that one sentence. "You landed." The woman, Sarah, stood up slowly. Her gloves were still on, the ones she wore to clean tray tables and scrub lavatory doors. Now they gripped the edge of the jump seat rail as she stepped forward, calm as mist, steady as steel. The co-pilot's voice was breaking. "I don't know what happened. He was fine during climb, but then he just stopped, froze up, hands locked on the yoke. No response. I disengaged autopilot, And something's wrong with the interface. The flight management system is cycling, but not. Sarah passed him silently, brushing past the curtain as if it were nothing more than a veil between two lives. Inside the cockpit, it was chaos, not in the alarms blaring firelighting sense, but in that eerie, quiet wrongness, the kind pilots don't talk about on the ground because there's no procedure to fix what feels broken. The captain was upright but unconscious, eyes open but empty, jaw slack, hands still gripping the yoke as if in rigor mortis. A dull buzz echoed from the center panel. Screens flickered, no failure warnings, but no normal readings either. Sarah leaned forward. "System override manual interface," she said softly, pressing a series of commands into the center console. The co-pilot blinked. "What are you—" But the aircraft responded. The panels adjusted, the systems realigned, the flight path relocked with a redundancy mode the co-pilot didn't know existed, because it wasn't supposed to exist anymore. "You're not a cleaner, are you?" he asked quietly. Sarah didn't answer.
Her hands moved with practiced certainty, shifting trim tabs, cross-checking altitude input, testing pressure stabilization. Every muscle in her body remembered this configuration, even though the last time she touched it was nearly 6 years ago, in a simulator buried in a hangar labeled Topaz 6. Back then, she wasn't Sarah. She was Echo 6, one of the original test pilots for the Aris military-to-commercial integration program. She'd flown this exact model before it ever made it to civilian skies. But when the project was deemed too adaptive and quietly shelved, everyone involved was cut loose. Records erased, contracts sealed, and her flight credentials revoked. Not for failure, but because she knew too much. She brought the aircraft down 2,000 feet, realigning the system pathways to legacy control protocols. The co-pilot watched in stunned silence. "You're flying her like she's alive," he muttered. Sarah nodded. She always was. Back in the cabin, turbulence rocked the overhead bins. A child cried 2 rows back. The flight attendants kept smiling, pretending all was fine, but their hands shook as they secured carts and made vague announcements about routine turbulence. Only the aircraft knew the truth. It was no longer flying itself. It had been taken back by someone it still remembered. And at 31,000 feet, the sky once again belonged to her. The co-pilot leaned against the bulkhead, eyes wide as Sarah's fingers danced over the controls. His brain couldn't quite make sense of what he was seeing. She hadn't hesitated once. Not when she sat down, not when she accessed the override protocols, not even when she took control of the aircraft with the kind of calm he'd only ever seen in combat veterans. And even then, only the best of them. He checked her ID badge again. It was clipped loosely to her jumpsuit pocket. Sarah Lane, Cabin Services. No clearance, no license, no right to be here. But the yoke said otherwise. So did the A750. Every correction she entered was greeted with smooth alignment, every deviation readjusted as if the aircraft itself was relieved. It wasn't just working. It was responding to her inputs the way it had been designed to during the early days of neural-linked interface development. That feature had been abandoned, too unpredictable, too human, unless you were the one who trained it. "You were Echo 6, he said aloud, almost involuntarily. Sarah didn't respond.
Her eyes remained forward, HUD glowing, telemetry clean, balance returned. She was flying a plane that had forgotten itself until it saw her. "You're not supposed to exist," he said, quieter this time. That made her turn. Her expression wasn't smug. It wasn't angry. It was tired, old, like someone who'd been erased not just from records, but from memory itself. She looked at him for half a second longer, then turned back to the controls. "Neither is this plane," she replied. 6 years earlier, when Echo program assets were liquidated and the military's experimental neural-linked systems were abandoned, Sarah had refused debriefing. They couldn't risk her speaking about the interface. But she also refused reassignment. She didn't want a desk. She wanted altitude. So they cut her loose, but not before redacting her credentials, blacklisting her under the guise of psychological unfitness after classified simulator incidents. Quiet punishment, no trials, no defense, no truth. She took a job cleaning the cabins of the planes she once helped design. Now she was back in the seat. The co-pilot stared at the captain, still unconscious. His vitals were stable, but whatever had caused the neurological lockout had triggered deeper fail-safes. Sarah glanced at the backup alert matrix, tapping once to mute a hidden secondary cascade. The A750 had been trying to correct itself based on conflicting logic paths. In other words, it didn't trust the pilot anymore, and it had initiated a passive override mode that only someone with Echo-level clearance would recognize. The co-pilot never stood a chance. But Sarah, she knew the language of this ship, and more importantly, it knew her. Altitude locked. Weather fronts ahead look stable. ETA still holds, she said, flatly. The co-pilot finally sat beside her. "You can fly the rest of the way?" Sarah didn't blink. "I never stopped flying." At 36,000 feet, Flight 714 glided across the North Cascades, steady and smooth. No one in the cabin knew they were being flown by someone who no longer technically existed. A woman with no call sign, no uniform, and no file. Only the machine remembered her. And sometimes that was enough. The cabin lights dimmed as the aircraft began its slow descent toward Vancouver airspace. Seatbelt signs pinged, trays were returned, and passengers shifted in their seats, blissfully unaware that the flight had ever been in danger. The captain still hadn't regained consciousness. He sat slumped in his chair, like a statue, upright, breathing but gone. Sarah made the last series of adjustments manually, guiding the aircraft with such ease that even the co-pilot's hands stayed off the controls. Every input she made was deliberate, fluid, silent. But what struck him most wasn't her flying. It was the tattoo. It had peeked out from beneath her sleeve just once when she reached for the throttle quadrant. Faint, faded with time, but unmistakable to someone who had ever served. A black and silver triangle, enclosed in concentric rings, barely bigger than a coin. Echo 6. The insignia had been reserved for a single experimental group of neuro-linked pilots trained under the Department of Advanced Aeronautics, a program so classified that only 4 known members had ever been acknowledged in post-program hearings. Sarah's name was not among them, because she'd walked away before they could list her. Or maybe because she was never supposed to survive the training. "Where did you train?" he asked gently, as the city lights began to glow on the horizon. Sarah didn't answer. She just looked out the window, watching the scattered constellations of a world that had once thrown her away. The sky hadn't forgotten her. The systems hadn't rejected her. But the humans had. The command chain, the bureaucrats, the ones who decided which name got remembered and which got buried. "You were one of the prototypes, weren't you?" Still silence. He leaned back. "I didn't even think Echo 6 was real. Thought it was some tech myth, pilots bonded to their aircraft like the old X-plane legends." I guess you were the proof. Sarah exhaled. They wanted soldiers who wouldn't flinch, so they built us for silence. He tilted his head. What happened? Her voice, when it came, was cold steel under velvet. I didn't flinch, but I questioned. Final approach was clean. Sarah flew the descent profile by memory alone, bypassing the degraded flight management system, using only tactile interface and visual cues. She guided the A750 like it was a part of her body, every angle, every correction. The tower didn't question the voice over the radio. She used standard codes, calm tone, perfect vernacular. For all they knew, she was a routine relief pilot, nothing out of place, just another day in the sky.
But when the wheels touched down, the aircraft rolled with a grace few had ever experienced. No bounce, no drag, just contact, like a whisper onto the runway. Then silence. Real silence. The kind that comes only after something impossible has been done. Sarah powered down the flight systems and stood up. The co-pilot stayed seated, unsure what to say or even if he should stop her. She didn't wait for permission. She reached for her cleaning tote, the same one she'd carried on board an hour earlier. As she passed him, he stood. "Wait," he said, voice shaky. "Will anyone even know what you did?" Sarah paused in the doorway. Her eyes met his. "They're not supposed to," she said. "That's how it was designed." Then she was gone. The airport's operations room received the report 27 minutes after touchdown. The captain was unconscious. The co-pilot had lost command of the aircraft mid-climb, and the aircraft had been landed manually by no one officially listed on the flight crew. No one had expected Flight 714 to be a security incident. And yet, here it was, a military-grade aircraft with a failed autopilot, a medical emergency in the cockpit, and a mysterious cleaner who had calmly stepped in and flown it to a flawless landing. By the time Sarah walked off the tarmac through the back maintenance corridor, 3 separate departments were already pulling logs: tower communication, cabin security footage, even gate personnel interviews. But nothing explained how she'd done it, or who she truly was. Because her real name wasn't Sarah Lane. That name didn't exist before 2018, and the records that did exist were scrambled across 3 military branches and a private contractor known only by its acronym, EXO. While officials debated what to do, Sarah was already on the other side of the airport. She had swapped the cleaner's uniform for jeans and a plain gray hoodie. No badge, no bag. Just a folded envelope in her back pocket and a pair of black gloves in her hand. She sat by a vending machine near Baggage Carousel 7, sipping a bottled water, unnoticed, unbothered, like a ghost in daylight. Her phone buzzed once. No caller ID, no number. Just a single line. Echo 6 confirmed. Welcome back. She didn't smile, didn't respond. She simply deleted the message and turned the phone off. Back at the aircraft, airport security was struggling to piece things together.
The flight attendants were stunned. The co-pilot kept repeating himself like someone waking from a dream. She didn't hesitate. She just sat down, like she'd been there before. And the plane reacted to her. Are you sure she was a cleaner? She had the tools, the uniform, but her eyes. He trailed off, because that was the thing. She hadn't looked like someone hoping to be a hero. She looked like someone returning to something that had always been hers. No panic, no adrenaline, just muscle memory and steel resolve. In a restricted hangar on the outskirts of the airport, 2 men in black coats watched the flight replay from cockpit cameras. They said nothing until the aircraft touched down. The footage was clean, too clean. Every move calculated, every correction precise. And that insignia, barely visible on her forearm, was unmistakable. One of the men closed the file and leaned back in his chair. I thought she vanished after Topaz 6. The other lit a cigarette and shook his head. She was always 2 steps ahead of us. That's why she survived the program. The first man frowned. She could have killed them all by flying that override. But she didn't. Silence. Then, do we contact her? No. Let her vanish again. And with that, they deleted the file from their screen. Sarah stood outside the airport's glass doors now, watching the horizon shift into evening. Somewhere behind her, someone was probably looking for answers. But there would be no name to run, no fingerprints to match, no social media, no online trail. The system that trained her had taught her to disappear. The mission had taught her to wait. Today the sky had called her back, not with glory, not with medals, but with something quieter, recognition, and that was all she ever needed. The investigation launched within hours. It wasn't about blame. It was about understanding how an aircraft flown by a commercial captain and a certified co-pilot had lost operational control, and how someone not listed on the crew manifest had landed it without triggering a single alarm in air traffic control. The cabin voice recorder provided little. Routine chatter, some turbulence updates, then silence. The moment things went wrong, there were no frantic calls, no mayday, just a break in communication and the low sound of the co-pilot breathing fast. Then came a rustle, the soft shifting of fabric, the click of a seat harness, and a voice. Female, calm, focused. Manual interface override engaged, resetting navigation logic path. Visual confirms positive. Altitude locked. That voice didn't match anyone on the flight roster. It wasn't a passenger, wasn't cabin crew, and the tone wasn't a civilian pilot's. It was military, tight, precise, the kind you heard in combat aircraft transmissions. The black box didn't know her name, but it remembered her. 3 days later, the NTSB issued a preliminary report. It mentioned a previously unknown systems-trained individual intervening under emergency conditions. The pilot was still hospitalized. The co-pilot refused to speak to press. The airline said nothing, only confirming that a system anomaly was corrected mid-flight with the assistance of an off-duty personnel member. Off-duty, that was the term they chose. Not unauthorized, not mystery, not ghost, but off-duty, as if she had simply stepped away from her shift, then stepped back in when needed. Somewhere in a maintenance hangar far from Vancouver, a junior mechanic reviewing the aircraft's onboard diagnostic logs paused when he saw an entry time-stamped at 34,112 feet. It read, E6 key engage, neural manual redundancy channel stabilized. He frowned. That wasn't standard software. It wasn't even in the updated aircraft operating manual. In fact, it shouldn't have been in the code at all. He showed it to his supervisor. The supervisor stared for a moment, then walked away without a word. The file was quietly removed from the log system minutes later. Meanwhile, Sarah walked a long rural road on the outskirts of town, her hoodie zipped up, duffel bag over her shoulder. The airport was a memory behind her. No fanfare, no medals, no farewell. In the distance, a private airstrip sat nestled between tall pine trees and an abandoned control tower. She stopped once, adjusting her sleeve. The tattoo was still there, worn, faded, but real. She ran her fingers over it, not with pride, not with nostalgia, but with purpose. Because she knew what most didn't. Machines could forget, people could forget, but skies remembered, and sometimes they called back their own.